Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 61 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is AJ, and joining me as usual is my buddy Scott. Hey man.
Hello. How are you on this fine day?
Doing well. And
I feel like, should we just come clean and say we recorded part 1 and part 2 of the series that we're in on the same day?
Unless you edit that statement out, then we just did come clean. But if we have any keen-eyed viewers of the video version, they'll see I'm in the same shirt. So are you.
Yeah.
And part
That's
2.
true.
But we made you wait a week to get this because
That's
we're
right.
just kind of that way, I suppose.
Well, we had more to say on this than we feel like we could have gotten one episode.
I don't know if we've ever done a two-parter, have we?
I don't know, but we have now. So there you go.
We'll ask our archivist if go back into the vault, the previous 59, and see if we had anything that was 2 parts. Last week, from your perspective, we talked about bailing on bad polity in part 1, and we listed 3 challenges to that. And this week, we're talking about steps for effective leadership structure. And so we're going to kind of give you the antidote to that bad polity that may be holding you back. And I think this will be a fun discussion too. Last week was really good. So go back and pick up episode 60.
Why don't we just do a really brief recap, AJ, of the challenges that you're going to have to navigate? Do you think let's do that? I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but 30-second sort of recap on what are the challenges, just in case someone hasn't listened to that.
Yeah. So last week, our first point, our challenge number 1 was the past. And sort of maybe structure that's already in place. And so we talked about the difference maybe even between independent churches or mainline denominational churches that have some structures in place that you have some rigidity in, that you don't have flexibility,
Sure.
But other areas in which you do. But in both cases, mainline, a denominational structure still has some flexibility at the local church level. And of course, independent churches do. But you can work through breaking through maybe traditions or constraints that you're not bound to gain some increased health.
Right.
Our second challenge was a real fun topic, and one that I'm sure we're going to talk about again in a later episode, but the need for democracy in the church, and where we really don't find a biblical basis for democracy in the church.
We do not.
We really only find more theocratic and anointed leadership, biblically speaking. That might in itself be a whole separate topic, but moving away from a very democratic, vote-based orientation of leadership and decision-making is liable to increase the health in your church, streamline decision-making, and maybe see more productive and effective ministry. And then our third challenge was the talent pool. You may not even have qualified and experienced and people with the right character and capacity for, to fill a breadth of leadership roles that you might have in your present structure. And so dialing that back, increasing the level of the people in fewer leadership and decision-making roles can again also increase your effectiveness and efficiency in ministry.
Yeah.
Like a good recap, Scott?
That's pretty good. Yeah.
Brought us up to speed.
Well,
Let me see, now I have to click
done.
that, though, over into today's episode. So, but anyway, so today is going to be some ways of moving past those challenges and getting you ready to move forward.
Yeah, that's right. So, once we understand the challenges that are ahead of us, we can recognize them and begin to move through them. And our highest recommendation here in terms of replacing bad polity, your gut instinct is going to be to replace your guiding documents. I've had this conversation now more times than I can really recount, but the instinct is, well, we got to replace our Constitution and bylaws. And that may be a byproduct of the situation. You might go, as a result of doing the things we're going to talk about, you may have to update your constitution and bylaws for sure. But the flaw in this thinking, AJ, is that if we just change our paperwork, it's going to change our procedures. And that isn't true, because as we talked about a little bit last week, a lot of churches aren't living out what they have on paper in the first place.
Yeah.
And so simply changing your paperwork is not going to change your processes for doing things.
Yeah.
And it's going to be more difficult than that. So we're recommending, we do this work with churches actually, and this is not one long sales pitch for it, but we do a work that we call leadership pipeline design. Where we talk about where we work with your church over the course of 2 days and then coach you for a year on implementing new policies, procedures, structures, and redesigning what leadership looks like in your church. And so here for free, you're going to get to hear some general 30,000 foot overview of some of the principles that we apply in that process, and think it's going to help you to bail on bad polity and develop an effective leadership structure in your church.
Yeah. I've worked with churches that really came to the conclusion where we're not really living out what the Constitution says already. So if we're going to be wrong, we can go ahead and be wrong differently and better. And then and maybe even then, some of the thought process, I think, is people will see it's better and they'll support it whenever we codify it with a formal vote later.
That's right. I always recommend redesign the process, then update the documents to support what you know will work in your church. Don't do it the other way around.
Yeah, give you maybe a few months of effective work under your belt. So let's move into our step one. So we're going to talk 3 steps today for building an effective leadership structure. And our first step is simply structuring for health, which is a broad title there, Scott. There's obviously a lot more to it. So kick us off on structuring for health.
Well, I'm trying to be maybe too cute by half, but lots of times you'll hear, well, your church needs to structure for growth. That's good. I mean, and I don't disagree with that, but you need to structure for health. What does health look like in your church? So the biggest mistake that churches make when they do leadership structure and design their leadership structure is it includes usually just the board, if there are any boards, then followed by the staff, and sort of like an organizational chart might just kind of show which staff reports to who's in charge of this and that or the other thing. And then very often the board isn't anywhere in that, or if you're a committee-led church, the relationships between the committees and the staff may not even be formal or understood. And so they're almost parallel to one another and sometimes in conflict. And so this is not good. What we want to have is a unified, coherent, sort of organizational chart or pipeline structure for levels of leadership that go from the board level or the executive level or the leading the organizational level all the way down to your baseline volunteer. So there are clean and clear lines of communication, accountability, and responsibility from the top all the way down to the bottom. This avoids rogue ministries, rogue teams, rogue committees that have no formal or clear connection to staff or ministries or how these things connect. So I'll often explain that a leadership pipeline structure, AJ, is not the same as an organizational chart, although there's a Venn diagram of overlap.
Yeah, sure.
So your leadership pipeline structure, your levels of leadership, will influence what your organizational chart looks like. But just because you have an organizational chart doesn't mean that you have a pipeline structure. So there's some overlap there. So maybe it's best here if you ask me some questions on what this means versus me just rattling on for 15 minutes on pipeline structure. Folks need to know about this structure.
I was about to say that, we haven't, even offline, Scott, we didn't talk about the benefits of vision deployment throughout a structure. That's a health point in which you don't see in a committee structure in a church, is the ability to clearly communicate vision across levels. Well, because it's flat. right? I mean, most of the time the committees are flat, and maybe some committees have even been elevated up too high of a level. They end up with a point of power specifically around finance or hiring that is way outside the scope of the talent usually, or the capacity of the group. But
Sure.
being able to, communicate vision down through the levels is hugely improved in the structure that you're speaking of, Scott.
Yeah. So when we work with churches in leadership pipeline design, we start with it can vary depending on the size and complexity of your church, but we start with a base assumption of 5 levels of leadership. Okay, and that base level is a leading self level. Can I show up 15 minutes before the service, lead myself to contribute to the body here? Second level up, this is a volunteer level. Second level up would be a leading others level, where maybe this is small group leaders and Sunday school teachers and children's ministry room leaders, these kinds of things, worship people who sing on the worship team or whatever. They're leading others in some capacity, leading in worship, leading in teaching. There's a next level up in terms of responsibility, but they're still executing tasks that are delivered to them. The third level up is going to be your leading others step. This is a management position. It's a coaching level, still volunteer. These first 3 levels are always volunteer. And it's a different level of skill, AJ, to say, okay, I'm going to take a strategy that's been given to me and I'm going to delegate within a particular team that I am managing. I'm going to manage the schedule for them. I'm going to assess these volunteers. I'm going to coach them up and build them up and grow these leaders and grow this team, right? It can be done by a volunteer. I often call this sort of like the missing middle in most church volunteer teams. This function doesn't exist. The next level up is your staff level or the leading departments level, AJ. And this is one that we're all familiar with. But what's critical is that when you get to this level, and then the next level above is going to be leading the organization. And to your point, AJ, it's at this level that vision is formulated and vision is decided upon. And then the key, this is why I mentioned this, is that trickles down then to every other level in the pipeline. And so you take vision development happens at level 5. Contextualizing vision into strategy or translating vision into strategy happens at level 4. Execution of that strategy or delegation of that strategy happens at level 3. Implementation of that strategy happens at level 2 and level 1. And so you take something as key and central as vision, and it trickles down then through the levels of the pipeline. What happens, to your point, AJ, and I hope that this is clear for our listeners and viewers, is that when you don't have a clear, healthy structure that is leveled in terms of function, people take on those roles and functions themselves in disparate ways with disparate results. So then it's the vision of the personnel committee. It's the vision of the finance team. It's the vision of the first impressions folks. So versus a unified vision that's trickled down and applied, which is much healthier and much more effective than competing visions that don't coordinate in any sustained way. Does this make sense?
Yeah. And this shouldn't be taken lightly either, because this is where we find, this is just another symptom in an unhealthy church, where vision doesn't exist and can't be discerned through levels. That's a major issue in the health of a church. And so this is, even if you're not thinking, well, I'm going to implement, a new level of leadership in a leadership structure because it's going to, help us just to be effective in what we do. Maybe you would see it as an unintended benefit of an increase of vision communication and execution. That is a huge result in your church. And so, that's why I love this so much. I love the possibility of the results of this. It has quite a breadth to it, aside from just like, hey, let's just reorganize things and how we're going to do it. And the other thing is, people in a committee structure, a very flat structure. You've got just, some random group of people in this committee, some random group in this committee. They have different committee. Is that a word? No, it's committee. They have different life experience, different work experience, different personal capacities to lead or to function in whatever that committee role is. And so you have like this weird disproportionate thing even happening within the committee itself. Whereas whenever we're working through defined levels, people with these different capacities can be elevated into proper levels, over time and over, being evaluated and things like that. Sure. Instead of these little pockets of people, sort of unequal to one another. Yeah. And ending up with maybe weird or influenced decision-making within themselves. So right. It's just, you just see huge benefits out of more of a designated structure.
Yeah. So this leads to maybe a very practical, pragmatic question that might come up for the listener or the viewer, which is, well, then what do we do with our committees? Do we, getting from what I just described, sort of a stratified leadership structure, how do I move from I've got 12 committees to that and do it? I couldn't, if I just tried to disband 12 committees, I'd have a riot. Yeah. And that's fair. That's a fair thing. What I would recommend in that case, usually I've seen this in a few different instances now in churches I've worked with, is we simply reorder. So rather than most churches, AJ, there's a very muddy relationship and connection between the committees and the staff. And it's not clear who's in charge. Yeah. Does the committee make decisions that the staff has to execute, or does the committee make decisions and the staff make decisions, the committee executes things and the staff executes things? This is where conflict can come and challenges arise. And so what's best to do is just to figure out, where does the committee fit and the members of the committee fit, so to speak, within that pipeline structure. And very often it's simply reorganizing that committee underneath the staff person, so that we have sort of our key committee or board, governing board or team exec at that sort of L5, leading the organization level, going down to the L4 who's translating that vision into strategy. And then that committee becomes, maybe we switch to team language, and that team executes or implements or delegates strategy, and they're making tactical decisions underneath the supervision of a staff person, or in the case of a smaller church, underneath the headship of a senior pastor or a couple of pastors. So it's maybe the key point here for a lot of churches, AJ, is just clarifying the structure in and of itself. For many churches, they have these teams, but there isn't any structure to it. These teams exist, and it's not clear how they relate to one another. Merely doing the work of mapping out how these things connect and how they relate and how they work together or don't work together is going to bring a lot of health to your church.
Let's kind of talk about an example, an actual example. Mm-hmm. Let's take finance committee. So people are thinking, okay, I have my finance committee and like all of our financial stuff has to go through them. How do I translate that now into this new leadership pipeline structure? What happens to our financial decisions?
All right, give me a few parameters. Is how many staff are on this hypothetical church?
So we've got pastor, associate pastor, youth pastor, children's ministry director.
Okay. So by function then, I've got my L5 team, which is going to be some sort of a board. Depending on your language in your church, it could be a deacon board or an elder board. That would be our preference. Elder board language, or it could be a church council. There's no rules on this, on what you'd call it, but they're leading the organization. The pastor serves on that committee. Pastor is kind of a unique role, senior pastor, in that he or she may serve as both the L5 and the L4 capacity, meaning he or she serves on that highest level board, but also serves as the translator of vision into strategy, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the complexity and size of the church. So finance would probably, based on the staff you just listed out to me, would probably be an area that the senior pastor oversees. So if you were to have an executive pastor, or maybe you said there's an associate pastor, maybe the
Yeah.
associate pastor oversees that group. So operations is maybe under his bucket. And so then you've got this finance team that reports to him. So the ultimate approval or not approval of the budget would actually move up to the role of L5. They're making that decision. So we've removed that decision making from them. But you have a team of operations folks, an operations team perhaps, or a finance team that is helping to formulate. They're executing, like, we've got this vision, we know what we're going to do, we know what we need to get done, let's get bids on insurance, let's figure out, they're working some of those details on behalf of the pastor so that he doesn't have to spend hours and hours a day getting quotes from insurance companies and looking into, are we using the right utilities provider, and doing the research on GuideStar to figure out if we're making the right decisions on our personnel expenses. Like, you're delegating to that team those things. And then that pastor, then that associate pastor takes that and brings it to the board and that L5 team, who then will approve or make recommendations and then send it back down. So does that make sense? So that you still would have a finance team, but instead of them sort of being the tail that wags the dog, their function is to assist and to execute that vision within the realm of finance.
Especially when you couple it with our zero-based budgeting, which
Sure.
what episode was that, Scott? 58?
Yeah, a few episodes ago.
A few weeks ago, in which, you're sort of decentralizing budget development, not budget approval, but budget development. Right. And this also fits really nicely whenever you've got leaders over ministry areas. And so
that would be the difference. So just to simplify and clarify, in your existing structure, the finance team might be the end all be all when it comes to financial decisions. In a better structure, they serve in a complementary way. They're helping to assist, but the ultimate authority goes to a centralized leadership team who isn't dictating all of the small minor details. They're empowering the finance team beneath them, trusting them to be good stewards of the vision that they've passed down to them. So it's on one level, I think, AJ, people see this as authoritative and like almost like a dictatorship, but a healthy leadership structure relies on trust all the way down. Yeah. So it's empowerment down to the bottom. And that's much healthier.
Yeah, which is what we see out of Scripture, really.
For sure.
I mean, not that I would call, biblical leadership dictatorship, but God does a little dictating.
It's empowered leadership.
Empowered leadership. Yeah. Okay, man, that's good. And it might be heavy for you. As Scott said at the beginning, we can walk alongside you through this and certainly talk in more detail. But it's important. It really is. And the results are really good. Our second step here out of our three, Scott, is setting the standard.
Yeah. Set the standard for leaders. So I think another, I don't want to call them out by name. I worked with a church a year or two ago who had a very influential board. It wasn't their elder board. They had another board that was really in charge of money. If you wanted to think of the elder board like the Senate, this board was like the Congress, okay? And so they made some very key financial type decisions. And or the House of Representatives, I should say, the way in which leaders were selected to be on this very important team, AJ, was simply they had a certain position within the ministry where they served. So like if you were the longest running person serving in children's ministry, by default, you were added to this board. And because you controlled all the money, you could actually control the whole direction of the church. You could totally hamstring the elder team because they could make a decision, but you could simply not implement it by not funding it.
Yeah.
And I was just disgusted, frankly, that the only standard for being on such a critically vital and powerful team was longevity. Like, you happened to be the longest serving person in a particular ministry area, and that gave you a seat on this critical board that could hamstring the elder board. That is wrong. It's crazy and it's wrong. But lots of churches have this situation, right? So what you need to do is you have to set the standard, what we would call in our leadership pipeline process, core competencies. It's no wonder churches don't have good leaders when they have never defined what it is that a leader is. And what is leadership? If you say in step 1, we're going to have these levels of leadership, the natural next step, AJ, is to say, well, what does it mean to be a leader at each level?
Yeah.
What does a level 1 leader look like? What does a level 2 leader look like? What does a level 3 leader look like? And by developing a clear set of core competencies, you're able to determine what leadership should look like at each level. And then you've got to enforce that standard across all ministry areas. So if you have certain standards for level 3 leaders, you have to implement those within the children's ministry and the student ministry and the groups ministry across the board. Otherwise, it's not a core competency.
Yeah. And, this is kind of an interesting thing, even in our, when you just described the structure a minute ago on levels, 1 through 5. Level 1, is just kind of an entry level volunteer position, but we're calling it a leadership position. And I think for a lot of existing leaders, church leaders, and people listening, that in itself is going to be a little bit of a mind shift. Maybe they kind of cock their head a little bit, like that's a leader position. And though it's very elementary, it needs to be seen that way so that we really see it rightly and handle it rightly. And so I think that's that at the very base of this is something that people have to get their head around and think about things differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, think through the full implications of that. If you were to start with defining levels of leadership, okay, and then you say, okay, we got to set standards for each level of leadership. This is not something that we generally do. First of all, because we aren't thinking clearly about our different volunteer positions in terms of levels. And so that's maybe one reason why we wouldn't ask the question in the first place. What are the qualifications? We really only apply the idea of qualifications or core competencies to those things which are explicitly mentioned in Scripture, like elder or deacon.
Yeah.
But the concept applies down line. If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, right? Like if it's important to have standards and qualifications for an elder, then it's important to have standards and qualifications for an L2 leader or an L3 leader, and certainly staff.
Mm-hmm.
And we often don't apply these things to staff. We go, well, staff's not an elder position. And sometimes it is, but many times it's not. But that's not the only relevant question, right? If it's not an elder, then it doesn't matter. No, the standards do matter. And if you were to think about what is an L4 or a staff level leadership, what are the qualifications for that? It would certainly influence the kinds of people you look at beyond just, do they have experience in that particular ministry or do they have the education? Mm-hmm. But what kind of person are they? What kind of leader are they? What capacity do they have in terms of leadership skills and abilities, not just proprietary skills and ability, like they can play the guitar and sing well, but can they lead a team? Can they manage a group of people? These kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And even these, think about some of the churches that you've worked with, Scott. I know for me, to put the term leader on maybe, I don't want to belittle any position in the church, but, a door greeter or, an assistant in children's ministry, reading stories or doing crafts. I've seen door greeters that I was like, oh my gosh, for the last 3.5 seconds, I was the most important person to them. They made me feel that way. And I'm glad I'm here because of that person versus someone who's skilled at moving their hand in this motion to hand me a bulletin. There's a difference in these people. And when you see these positions in a leadership capacity, it makes you want to go, is this the right person, for this position?
Yeah. And this is maybe a good transition to our third and final step, but just remember that today's greeters are tomorrow's elders.
Yeah,
And,
that's a good
and
rule.
so, understand that they are leaders,
Yeah.
and they're developing leaders, which moves to step 3.
Right. Yeah. Step 3 is leave nothing to chance. And we're talking about being able to equip people for that next level of leadership. Don't put somebody in somewhere and then just let nature take its course. We've got to have intention, right, Scott?
Oh, so important. I get a little bit frustrated, more than a little, when I hear churches say things like, well, God will bring us the leaders. Okay. Or, all right. I mean, I know that he will, for sure, but you got to look at, like, how did Jesus lead? Jesus didn't sit around and be like, Father, bring to me 12 disciples. What did he do? What did he do, AJ? Seriously, what did Jesus do?
He went out looking.
He went out looking. He tapped on some shoulders. Hey, follow me. You, come on. You, follow me. I'm going to make you fishers of men. He didn't leave anything to chance. And we could look at that and go, well, he has divine insight, and he has, which is true, obviously. Yeah. And that, Jesus is different than us. Also true. But I don't think that in this particular instance, AJ, Jesus is setting a standard that we could not follow.
Yeah.
I think he's making it really clear for us that when he prays, he says, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he would send laborers into the harvest. The prayer is for leaders.
Yeah.
It's not for the harvest. The harvest will take care of itself. He's saying, you go looking for leaders. And when he sends them out, AJ, the 12 and then the 72, he's not sending them out. Think about this. He's not sending them out. You get this by the context. Read it. He's not sending them out to go and reap the harvest. He's sending them out to go find more laborers.
Mm-hmm.
Go look for people who are receptive to the message, people who will follow me, who will be willing to be trained. Yeah. Find those folks.
There's been millions of diamonds unearthed over the centuries. I'm confident in saying not one ever came out polished in a princess cut.
Sure.
So yeah, you've got to do some work. You can't expect it to just be there.
Yeah, you got to do some work. And so ingraining the idea of leadership development into the core of who you are as a church is so important. And the key point I want to make here, AJ, is that individuals can be good at leadership development, and that's a good thing. But what you want is a church that's good at leadership development. You want to create a system of leadership development in your church, mm-hmm. a process of leadership development in the church that outlives you. You want to be generationally faithful at developing leaders in your church. That's success. Success is not you as the pastor identifying some, a handful of guys or girls, or people, whatever, that you can mature and see mm-hmm. grow as leaders. Success in your church is creating a system of leadership development that outlives you. That's success.
Yeah.
And so when I say leave nothing to chance, what I mean is you got to get real serious about leadership development mm-hmm. and creating a process for that and a system for that in your church.
Yeah, absolutely. That can't be overstated. Yeah. It's key to the future success of your church and longevity and legacy of making disciples that you make this change. Please make this change.
Yeah. And last point I want to make on this is that it takes some humility, because what I see a lot in churches that I'm working with, AJ, especially older ones, more established ones, is tight grips of control mm-hmm. on leadership. And when you take that attitude and when you take that approach, what you are not doing is equipping the next generation to lead when you die.
Yeah.
And there will be a leadership vacuum. And more often than not, younger leaders will just leave. It's already happening. Just look around your church. Yeah. How much of the failure of your church to reach the next generation is because you haven't let go of leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, gosh, even aside from First Timothy and Titus, we haven't even mentioned Ephesians 4. I mean, this, this whole point of building up and leading, so that everybody can be brought to maturity and unity in the church. So, I mean, there's this whole other aspect to it that we're missing out on, and the fruit from it is, immeasurable.
Right. Right. Well, let's briefly recap here our 3 steps for leadership development.
Yeah. So first, structuring for health. So building out an intentional structure of leadership in your church, from your base level volunteers up to your board level, whatever term you might want to use for that, but up at your church council, elder board, and knowing who's in charge of what, who's supposed to be doing what should their capacity be in each of those levels. It's very important.
Right.
Number 2, Scott, setting the standard for leadership in the church. We can't just let that go. I mean, we've got to know what does good leadership look like
at every level, not just at the elder level or at the staff level, but all the way down. What's the standard?
And for you, maybe that's redefining what leader even means in the church, because you might have a very narrow view of that. Maybe you're only seeing it up at that highest level, and we've got to begin to see that there are levels of leadership in the church, from top all the way down to the bottom.
Yep.
And then finally, step 3, leaving nothing to chance. And this is absolutely our building up and our training piece in this. Once we have, we've established a structure, we've set standards for what good performance and function look like, and we've got to be able to build each other up in this and increase people's capacity in each of these levels as well. And having what in our leadership pipeline, what we call turns of being able to make the leap then from level 1 to level 2 and on up. As Scott said, today's door greeters are tomorrow's elders. So, that's not a direct, you don't go from level 1 to level 5. There's a pathway to this. But unless we've got structures in place, training structures in place to be able to move people from one level to the next, and, leaders to be able to recognize these characteristics in others, then, we might implement something, but it becomes static. And the point of this is not for it to be static. The point of this is for it to be dynamic and moving and progressing and increasing in capacity and effectiveness, which then, as Scott said, increases now legacy in your church. It's not bound to one specific leader or a very small group of leaders. You've established something now that gives you the ability to take your church generation after generation in a healthy way of always making progress in essentially in our mission in making them mature in disciples.
That's right.
So
it's less important for you personally to be great at developing leaders, although that would be good. It's not the end goal. The end goal is for your church organizationally to be always developing leaders intentionally and continually, assessing, training, launching leaders is what we would say in the pipeline process. Sort of a bonus step, just a side note to mention, to kind of just to bring back up what we said at the beginning, AJ, that once you've developed this process and this structure and these standards for leadership, you would probably want to formalize this. So update your documents and update your bylaws and all of that to formalize a structure that that works. And I would be remiss, AJ, if I didn't mention that we do help churches with this. So I feel confident that churches can develop this and apply this on their own, but it's certainly a lot easier with a little bit of help. Bringing one of us in to someone from our team in to walk you through this process over the course of 2 days. So in 2 days, we could rework this structure, and then over the course of the subsequent year, we help you implement it. So just to be clear, there's not an assumption that in 2 days you would be done and it would be over and it would be you would have this new structure. We would design it over 2 days, and then we work with you over the course of a year to implement it. So that's our runway, so to speak. Over the course of 12 months, we see you move from dysfunction to functional and effective.
Yeah.
And, I don't know. So this isn't a sales pitch, but it works. It works. Just ask the churches that have gone through this process. I mean, they know, they're seeing that it really works. And just one example, this church that I in Florida that went through our pipeline process, AJ, last year, so before COVID hit, they were like so glad that they had gone through this process before COVID hit. He said it radically changed our pastoral response to COVID-19. Had we not gone through this process, their church of maybe 500 or so people, we would have just been slammed as a staff. We wouldn't have had any margin we would have had to choose between good pastoral work and pivoting sort of the worship and the functional things we had to do. And your church may have been in that exact situation. Where are we going to pour our time into figuring out tech and how we're going to do church and the ministry and the organizational things? Or am I going to pour my time into people? But because they had implemented this leadership pipeline, AJ, they had the downline leaders who were taking really good pastoral care of their whole church. And so he called me and he said, man, it revolutionized church for us. I'm so glad we did this before COVID hit. And man, to me, like that's why we get up and do what we do, right? To hear a church say, not what we did, but these biblical principles of leadership and implementing them radically improved the health of our church. That's a win.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've been listening to episode 61 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. You can read today's show notes at malfersgroup.com/61, just the number 61. We'll also have audio there for you to listen to this. Subscribe. We'd love for you to subscribe. And a YouTube link as well if you would like to see yours truly and the wonderful Scott Ball in person on the video thingy thing. Then you can do that. But thanks for being with us.
Put a face with a voice. And after you do, you may have regretted putting a face with that voice.
And if you do want more information about leadership pipeline development, you can get to that on malfersgroup.com. We've got information there. You can click on connect with a guide to schedule a meeting with Scott or myself. Would be glad to talk with you about that. Or you can just drop us an email, leadership@malfersgroup.com.
Thanks for being with us. Hey, you guys have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.